Most people planning a Europe trip already have one place in mind: Italy. For the coastlines, for the stone towns, for the feeling of slowing down. But not everyone experiences it that way. Places feel more crowded than expected. Moments feel a little more structured. And the slower pace people imagine can sometimes feel harder to find. So what if that feeling was never limited to one country in the first place? Just across the Adriatic, there's a place where the landscape feels familiar, but the experience feels different. Less arranged, less crowded, and somehow closer to what people were hoping to find. For decades, that feeling has shaped how people imagine Europe. Slow mornings, wandering streets, places that seem designed for simply staying a little longer than planned. The version we imagine and the version we experience don't always feel the same. So what if that atmosphere, the coastal towns, the Venetian architecture, the slower pace of everyday life, was never limited to one country in the first place? What if that same feeling still exists just across the Adriatic? In a place many travelers pass on their way to somewhere else? This journey follows that question. This is the 7-day version of the journey. The same route, just with a little more space between places. Because here, an extra day doesn't mean seeing more. It simply means experiencing each stop a little more fully. If you have one less day, this same journey can be done in 6. You simply continue inland. On the same day, you leave the coast. It works. But the transition becomes quicker. the mountains arrive before the coastline has fully settled. What most travelers don't realize yet is that Montenegro changes completely halfway through this journey. In just 6 to 7 days, you move through Montenegro from quiet medieval towns along the Adriatic coast to alpine landscapes deep in the mountains. Not rushing between landmarks, not trying to see everything, but traveling the way Europe often feels best experienced. Slowly, curiously, and with enough space for places to reveal themselves. If this kind of travel resonates with you, the slower kind that values atmosphere over checklists, you can support it by liking the video. It helps this style of storytelling reach travelers who were searching for the same thing. And by the time you reach the later part of this journey, you'll be standing above the deepest canyon in Europe and one of the most dramatic river canyons on the continent. Yet, despite landscapes on that scale, it still receives far less international attention than many of Southern Europe's headline destinations. The silence feels almost untouched, and that final moment quietly reframes everything you experienced along the coast. But every journey has to begin somewhere. And in Montenegro, most of them begin inside the stone walls of Kotor. The first mistake many travelers make in Europe is treating arrival as a transition instead of part of the experience. In Montenegro, especially in Kotor, the first day works best when you let the place arrive before you do. Kotor sits deep inside the Bay of Kotor. A stretch of water, so dramatic it's often mistaken for a fjord. Technically, it isn't. The bay is actually a flooded river canyon. But standing along the harbor, watching mountains rise, almost vertically from the sea, the distinction doesn't feel particularly important. The geography explains the mood immediately. Stone walls rise directly from the water. Medieval lanes twist through the old town, like passages built long before maps. Cats sleep in doorways, like permanent residence, barely opens an eye as you step around it, as if travelers passing through is simply part of the daily routine. Italy-style travel never rushes day one. Neither does Montenegro. Day one here isn't about seeing everything. It's about settling. Check into a small guest house near the old town walls. Nothing extravagant. Maybe the stairwell smells faintly of detergent. Maybe the shutters don't quite close perfectly. But the stone walls keep the room cool. Even when the afternoon heat settles over the bay. By evening, you walk without an agenda. Coffee arrives, strong and slightly bitter. The waiter disappears for longer than expected. No one seems concerned. The light slowly changes. As the mountains turn gold, the bay becomes almost perfectly still until a small fishing boat cuts through the reflection and breaks the illusion. It isn't cinematic perfection. It's just geography doing its work. One night here is enough to settle, not to conquer. Just to settle. But the next morning reveals something about Kotor. Most travelers only understand after seeing the town from above. Some views feel different for one simple reason. You've worked a little to see them. Before the cruise ships begin, there's slow choreography in the bay. Start climbing toward the San Giovanni fortress. Entry is paid, and the current fee is worth checking before you go, since it can change over time. For perspective, climbing a historic tower in Pisa can cost nearly 30 euros. Here, the view costs less, and somehow feels earned. Stone steps rise along the mountainside. Some uneven, some polished smooth from centuries of footsteps. Halfway up, someone pauses to catch their breath. And so do you. Not because you have to, but because the climb feels better when it isn't rushed. From the upper terraces, the entire bay opens beneath you. Terracotta rooftops cluster around the harbor. The water folds quietly between mountains. Wind brushes through dry grass. A loose stone shifts underfoot. For a moment, the entire town feels smaller than it did earlier. Back down in the old town, details start appearing everywhere. Above certain doorways, you notice carved lions. The Lion of St. Mark, a quiet reminder of Venetian rule here between 1420 and 1797. History in Montenegro isn't displayed like a museum exhibit. It's simply built into the walls. Lunch arrives later in the afternoon. Grilled seafood served fresh along the Adriatic coast. The kind of meal you'll find all along this side of the Mediterranean. Simple, familiar, and usually far less expensive than what you'd expect in places like Venice. By evening, the streets soften again. Laundry sways gently between balconies. A child kicks a football against an old stone wall. And slowly, something becomes clear. Places like this reward travelers who leave space in their day. If journeys like this resonate with you, where places unfold gradually instead of quickly, consider subscribing. The bell icon simply helps us stay connected as we explore more places like this. But once the rhythm of Kotor begins feeling familiar, the next place quietly lowers the volume. Just 20 minutes along the bay, the shift becomes noticeable almost immediately. Most travelers reach Perast by the Blue Line bus or a short taxi ride, usually about 15 to 20 minutes from Kotor. The distance is small, but emotionally, the shift feels much larger. The road curves around the water. Mountains remain the same. But the soundscape changes. Footsteps echo more clearly. Conversations soften. Perast stretches along a single narrow waterfront street. Stone houses face directly into open water. In the morning, you hear simple things. Spoons tapping ceramic cups. Someone rinsing salt water from a boat. A door closing somewhere, further down the street. From the harbor, small boats drift toward Our Lady of the Rocks. Local boat drivers make the short trip throughout the day. Short boat rides to the island are common, and usually inexpensive. Though prices can vary by season and boat type. Less than a gondola photo in Venice. A small man-made islet, shaped over centuries by local tradition, with stones added after sailors returned safely from voyages. Layer by layer, Inside the church, silver votive plates line the walls. Some frames are slightly worn. Nothing overly polished, just quietly maintained. Lunch stretches longer than expected. Fresh seafood, local white wine, a waterfront table where the breeze occasionally lifts the napkin from your plate. No one rushes the bill. And slowly, something becomes clear. Quiet places have a way of filling time differently. And when you spend a little longer around the Bay of Kotor, you begin to notice that the water becomes part of the experience too. By late afternoon, return slowly to Kotor. The distance is short. But the second evening feels different, more familiar, less observed. Spend one more night here. If you're planning a similar route through the Bay of Kotor, many travelers explore these waters by boat. There are trips that visit Our Lady of the Rocks, hidden submarine tunnels, and the Blue Cave further out in the bay. If you'd like to experience that side of Montenegro, you can find a few of the most popular tours through Get Your Guide in the description below. They're the same trips most travelers end up searching for once they arrive here. And booking ahead simply makes the day a little easier and cheaper. But Montenegro doesn't stay quiet forever. Further down the coast, the Adriatic suddenly feels very different. Along the coastline, the energy changes. Cafes fill faster. Music drifts through narrow streets. The old town remains wrapped in historic walls. But the atmosphere feels less preserved and more lived in. You feel the Adriatic more openly here. Sun on skin, salt drying on shoulders. Along this stretch of coast, the experience begins to split in small, noticeable ways. At Slovenska Beach, the rhythm feels familiar. A long promenade, cafes lining the edge, rows of sunbeds, arranged with quiet precision. It's easy. Convenient. And for many travelers, that's exactly the point. But a short ride toward Jazz Beach, just outside the center, and something begins to loosen. The shoreline opens wider. The spacing changes. Not necessarily more beautiful, but easier to exist in. Step into the water, and it's colder than expected. The kind that makes you pause for just a second. Behind you, someone adjusts an umbrella. Further down, a towel lies directly on the sand. No structure around it. And it's in these small, almost unremarkable moments that the coastline begins to feel different. Not untouched. Not undiscovered. Just not entirely arranged. Along parts of the Amalfi Coast, the beach experience can feel far more commercialized and expensive. Head 15 minutes south to a fortified island, connected by a pink sand causeway. Appears almost unreal against the sea. Sveti Stefan. The islet itself is not generally open for casual visits, so most travelers experience it from the shoreline. Which means one of the Adriatic's most iconic views can still be experienced simply by standing quietly in the sand. Wind lifts slightly. The sky slowly turns orange. Elsewhere along the Mediterranean, views like this are often tied to luxury stays. Here, the shoreline still lets you experience it more freely. And somewhere around this point in the journey, something subtle begins to change. Up until now, Montenegro feels like a quieter version of Italy. The stone towns, the Venetian history, the Adriatic coastline, but the moment the road begins climbing inland, you realize the country has been holding something back. Because the biggest surprise in Montenegro isn't the coastline people come for. It's what happens when the sea suddenly turns into mountains. Leaving the coast, the road begins climbing, almost immediately. This climb follows the Lovcen Serpentine Road, a series of dramatic switchbacks rising above the Bay of Kotor. one of the most scenic drives in the Balkans. Pulling over at one of the viewpoints takes 10 minutes. No ticket. No queue. Just perspective. Within 30 minutes, the air feels cooler. The landscape begins to change. Mediterranean shrubs slowly give way to alpine forest. From above, the bay now feels distant, smaller than it did earlier. Not long after the Serpentine Road, the route passes through Njeguši, a small mountain village known for its cured meats and local cheeses. Stone houses sit quietly along the roadside. Nothing curated. Nothing arranged for passing travelers. A wooden table tilts slightly on uneven ground. Fresh bread, Njeguški pršut, air-dried ham shaped by the mountain climate. Local cheese. Coffee arrives, strong and unceremoniously. No menu explanation, no presentation, just food that belongs to the landscape around it. The kind of place you don't remember for what you ate, but for how naturally you arrived into it. From here, the journey continues inland. But instead of completing the full drive in one stretch, pause somewhere along the way. Breaking the journey here changes the rhythm of the day. Further north, the terrain opens again. And the Tara River Canyon appears almost without warning. Standing on Georgijevica Tara Bridge, wind moves beneath the structure. The canyon drops to roughly 1,300 meters in places, making it the deepest canyon in Europe. Pine forests stretch endlessly in every direction. It feels closer to the Dolomites than the Mediterranean. By evening, arrive at Žabljak, the small mountain town that acts as the gateway to Durmitor National Park. Streetlights are fewer here. The air feels noticeably colder. Sleep comes earlier in the mountains. Spend the night here. One practical note helps here. Fuel stations become less frequent inland. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of detail that keeps the day smooth. Travel intelligence isn't about worrying. It's about moving calmly. And this is where the journey quietly changes again. because the final landscape in Montenegro feels like an entirely different country. Morning arrives cooler in the mountains. With a full day here, there's no need to rush the lake. The Black Lake, Cherno Jezero. Sits quietly at the edge of a dense pine forest. Behind it rise the limestone peaks of Durmitor. Among them stands Bobatov Kuk, the highest peak in the range. At 2,523 meters, it quietly dominates the skyline above the forest. The same calm alpine lake feeling as Lago de Braias, without the crowd choreography. The atmosphere feels closer to the Alps than the Adriatic. Walk slowly around the lake. Tree roots cross the trail. Wild ducks drift quietly across the water. Somewhere deeper in the forest, someone laughs softly. Or take a small wooden rowboat out onto the water, available during the season. Drift toward the center of the lake. Where reflections begin to sharpen. The silence here isn't dramatic. It's spacious. And somewhere in that quiet space, perspective shifts. Because somewhere between the Adriatic coast and these alpine forests, something becomes clear. Italy may have taught the world how to slow down. But Montenegro simply never forgot. Montenegro works for a simple reason. It hasn't fully turned into an idea yet. The towns are still lived in. The coast still belongs partly to the sea. And the mountains remain quiet, partly because fewer travelers reach this far inland. Within 6 to 7 days, the landscape moves through an entire rhythm. Water to stone. Stone to forest. Forest to silence. And when travel unfolds this way, it stops feeling like sightseeing. it begins feeling like movement. And if the mountainside of Montenegro is something you'd want to experience more easily, there are ways to explore it without having to plan every step. Some travelers choose guided day trips into places like Durmitor, the Tara River Canyon, and the George Vetsa Bridge, often including rafting through the canyon or slow walks around Black Lake. It's not necessary for this journey, but it can make parts of it simpler, especially if you prefer having the route and logistics taken care of. We've left a few well-rated options in the description below, if you'd like to explore it that way. If this kind of journey resonates with you, you can support it in a simple way. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so we stay connected as we explore more places like this. Because sometimes the best way to rediscover Europe is simply stepping slightly to the side of it and noticing what's still intact.